Now, by profession, I am a geologist, so I always like to talk about the geology a little bit, but we'll just get through this as quickly and painlessly as possible in one slide, and then we'll be on to the good stuff. The caves that we have in Minneapolis and St. Paul are rather different than the caves generally. The vast majority of the caves in the world, not to mention Minnesota and the United States, are limestone caves. And these natural caves were dissolved out by slightly acidic groundwater. So how are the caves in St. Paul and Minneapolis different? They are in sandstone rather than limestone, and they were not dissolved out by groundwater. They were basically flushed out. It's just the water flowing through the rock and just flushed it grain by grain until there was a giant cavity there. And so we have a bunch of caves that are natural in origin, but the early public works department here discovered that this layer was very easily excavated. And the tunnelers in St. Paul especially, much more so than Minneapolis, they went wild and carved hundreds of miles of tunnels. And when you're down there admiring them, you can see that there's like excess tunnels they don't even really need, and abandoned tunnel systems, one atop the other, below our fair city. And it was just so easy to excavate. Labor was cheap back then. And it's not like tunneling, like if you're digging tunnels under Manhattan, you have to bore through hard metamorphic rocks. They're really expensive to cut through, and this is like, cutting through butter. So that's why we have so many mines. That's why St. Paul especially is so special and blessed, if you will, with this sort of thing. Next slide. And next slide. I'll start with Carvers Cave, or Wakan Tibi, as Native Americans call it, the house of the Great Spirit. Because Carvers Cave is the, I call it the baptismal font of Minnesota caving. Because this is where Jonathan Carver, back in 1766 and 67, first noted in published literature that, hey, there's a cave here. So it's the earliest reference. And here we are in 2016. This is the 250th anniversary of that. So we've had a quarter of a millennium of Carvers Cave with us, and it still looks a lot like perhaps it did originally. Here's a view of it in 1867, after only 100 years after its discovery, in this quick sketch. And you can see there the characteristic subterranean lake that is still inside the cave. You can see some people back there whooping it up in a boat. And there's not as much airspace in there today, however. Next slide. Now here's the exterior of the cave. I'll show you the interior in a moment. This is how it looked in 2005. Now, you might wonder where exactly the cave is in all this. Just to point out the obvious. The cave it's right around the edge of the steel doors there. These steel doors were installed in 1977. Carvers Cave had been lost for many years. And as a sort of a little bicentennial project that got a year late, in 1977 then, they finally relocated the cave, dug it open, and as soon as they dug it open, it's like, oh my God, there's an open cave. What do we do with it? Let's close it. So they put the steel doors in front of it. It's just a weird thing, So, and then debris fell over this over time, down in front of it. And here they have cleaned. This is during the development of Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary. They reamed out all the sand in front of the doors. And now that if you go out there, as I'm sure many of you have seen, it's covered with vines and graffiti and little prayer strings. The Native Americans are in the bushes and so on. The person here is John Anfinson, a National Park Service historian. I was kind of touring him around back then. And you can see up at the top there's a little opening for people to crawl into. Next slide. So this is this is a photograph from 1999. What it looks like today, what it looked like then. It looks much the same today. In the back end of the cave is deep, cold water. It's cold spring water, flowing at 40 gallons a minute. And it's so cold that you have to wear a wetsuit generally to, if you want to stay in there any amount of time. And here we see our brave explorer, whose feet probably aren't even touching the floor of the cave. That's how deep the water is. Next slide. Carvers Cave is, for a cave 80 feet long, this cave, it has a history longer than any other cave in this state. It's just, Mystery Cave, the largest cave in Minnesota down in Forestville State Park. It has a comparatively, very brief history compared with this one, which just fills ring binders. There are many curious aspects to this. One of the things I'm fascinated with is the different kinds of animals that inhabit Carvers Cave, and a number of which I've seen myself. I've identified a number of small crustacean, shrimp-like animals in there. I was in the cave in 1999 and came across a beaver who was very irritated. He turned the cave into his private pond. And he had like a big cache of sticks on the beach inside the doors. And he was planning to settle down there for a while. And furiously slapping his tail on the water. But another creature that was said to inhabit Carvers Cave is this one, the buffalo snake. And also known as the monster of Carvers Cave. A very strange looking creature, and if you know what cryptozoology is, it's the study of fabulous beasts that perhaps do not exist. This certainly falls into that category. Somebody has pointed out, I think I posted this on the old St. Paul, and somebody rightly pointed out, this creature here actually resembles the hodag. If you know the hodag of Rhinelander, Wisconsin, that weird creature. And so there may be a connection there. This is just part of some upper Midwestern folklore. Next slide. Okay, so Carvers Cave, that's one thing. Okay, it's the most historic cave. But the second most historic cave, and certainly a much greater one in a physical sense, is Fountain Cave. And that is the cave famously where the city of St. Paul was supposedly born. It is like the womb of St. Paul, so to speak. And Fountain Cave still exists, but it was sealed in 1960 during a highway project. So it's still down there. I spent a lot of time looking for it. I described that in my book. Incidentally, I have the copies of these books on Carvers Cave and Fountain Cave available for sale during the break and afterwards. But Fountain Cave was special in the sense that it was a very large cave. Carvers Cave, about 80 feet long. Fountain Cave was 10 times longer. It was a really long cave. And it was over 1,000 feet long. Whereas Carvers Cave only had one room in it, in the room containing the lake. Fountain Cave had 4 rooms in it, one of which contained a waterfall. And they had tours through this place. It was a really and the other historical associations not so flattering like this one. Pierre Pig's Eye brand this is taken from a postcard. It's part of the advertising for the Pig's Eye brand of beer. Next slide. But this is what Fountain Cave really looked like. So that postcard view was just kind of like, just some artist's guess as to what the entrance looked like. This is what it really looked like. And this happens to be the oldest image of a Minnesota cave in existence. This dates to 1850, and this shows Fountain Cave in its heyday, and you can get an idea why it was called Fountain Cave, because it had that stream flowing out of it. So whereas Carvers Cave had a lake, Fountain Cave had a stream inside of it. And here we see the artist, probably the artist himself sitting there. This image records some authentic geological details, and someone that wasn't actually doing it from life couldn't have possibly picked up on. For example, it has here, you can see, this is what geologists call a bedding plane. There's a very strong bedding plane through the St. Peter sandstone, that part of St. Paul. And you couldn't have known that. You had to actually observe it. These little things here are meander niches, probably carved by the stream when it was up at this level, and just kind of a loop of it went through there. But as with the tendency of humanity everywhere, we see here even the earliest image of a Minnesota cave. There's graffiti everywhere. This is just a human trait. Next slide. Next slide. So I'll just go through a few categories of caves here till the break. First one is lagering caves. Now, lagering caves began about 1840 when the first Bavarian brewers came to Minnesota and brought this new process for making beer. Now, all the beer in the United States before 1840 was basically, if you said beer, you meant like an English ale. Okay, but in 1840, these guys give this new process for creating lager beer, and the lagering, that is basically, it means it has to be stored at lower temperatures for a period of time during the fermentation. Now, where are you going to do this in 1840? Well, they soon figured out that this, St. Paul was ideal for this, because all you do is you dig it, hollow out a sandstone cave, and the natural refrigeration provided by the earth, that insulation, was sufficient to make the lagering process work. And that's why St. Paul has all these lagering caves all over the place. Now, Minneapolis has a few, but not nearly as many as St. Paul. And here's a friend of mine in the so-called Banholzer Brewery Cave under Shepherd Road. And the Banholzer, sometimes known as Frankie's Cave. Anyone here would go in that cave? You would raise your hand, be brave. This cave, in its day, was the king of party caves for the West 7th Street area. And there's a very good reason for this. It's not only, okay, just like a sand beach in there, you're away from the eyes of your parents and, and all that kind of thing. But it had some special properties. It had some special things about it. And one of those is that it had 2 entrances. What opportunity does this present? So when the police come in one entrance, you go out the other and make your escape. And so this game went on for quite a while. Rowdy parties down there, and then the police would get involved and never could catch anyone until they finally figured it out, and then they stationed like a police officer at the other side. So then when they shot tear gas in one side, so everyone ran towards the usual exit and into the waiting arms of St. Paul's finest. So this cave did have, it did have its ups and downs. Next slide. Here's one of the elaborate carvings in that cave. It's usually called the Weary Sage. It's quite a large carving, very ornate. Next slide. And I was in the cave surveying, and I just found some huge mushrooms growing there. And you can see a clipboard for scale. And then here on the clipboard, you can see, here's a map of the cave. Next slide. Now, one of the things that is you might have heard in the news, and whether in the evening news or elsewhere, that there's been a tragedy in this country in recent years. There's something called white nose syndrome, which has been afflicting our bats. And white nose syndrome, it's called that because the bats during their hibernation, they're hibernating in winter, they get their, a fungus begins to grow on their nose, and they get this big white, it looks like they've got a white nose. And it is a fatal illness, and it has been killing off bats all over the United States. This bat epidemic started in 2007 in New England, and it's been spreading westward ever since. And we just learned this year, some of our colleagues at the DNR, that it is, unfortunately, white nose syndrome is here in Minnesota. It killed a lot of bats up at the Carvers Cave mines. So anyway, there's a researcher at the University of Minnesota, Christine Salmon, shown here, in her white Tyvek suit. We did a trip to Van Holzer Cave just last December, and she was collecting samples all around the cave in the hopes of finding a cure for this white nose syndrome. I guess her theory is that anything that resists it is probably already in the environment there. It's all she has to do is like sample, do the genetic analysis on the DNA found in those sediment samples. So she has a huge federal grant to work on this. But there she is, all nice in her Tyvek suit. And the thing is, so when she's done here, then what she'll do is when she exits, the whole point of this, when she exits the cave, then she can take that Tyvek suit off, then it can be burned, and she can go in another cave without transferring the spores. Because we found a huge bat population in this cave, and the idea is if you go in there, you don't want to bring those, if it has white nose spores, you don't want to transfer them to another cave, so you have to take these precautions. Next slide. And here we are again doing, surveying in this cave, counting the bats. This is the so-called Hazelden hallway in Van Holzer Cave. Now the Hazelden campus off of West 7th there is expanded, as you may know. It's right off of Shepherd Road. And they built right on top of the cave, and they had to collapse a few of the rooms inside the cave, to get a firm foundation or something. And so you can see the results of that here. The parallel cave passage has been completely demolished, and the sand from that has kind of overflowed into this passage. So we're directly under Hazelden at this point. Next slide. Here's another log ring cave. Angelo mentioned the Hams caves, and so here's a map of those. Next slide. And some of you in the audience here joined me in this trip to the log ring caves last year, about a year ago now. And the owner of this now, Flat Earth Brewery, of course, runs this place, and they gave me permission to go down there and check it out. If I would do him a favor, and it was actually a kind of odd favor to ask, but he thought there was a dead body down there. Just kind of go check it out.
He started the rumor.
See if it's down there, whatever. So I'm used to this kind of stuff. So apparently he was standing, there's a long stairways going down from the brewery down into this cave, twists and turns and stuff, and apparently he smelled a dead body way down there. So I went down there with some friends, and so far as I can tell, all it was a leaking sewer pipe down there, and he mistook that for a decomposing body. So I was happy to report back. There's no, you think it's something the police would get involved with, but apparently no, they didn't. So Anyway, so here then on the right hand side, another friend of mine, Tim. There he is, like John Travolta, staying alive or whatever. Now, so now this cave is entirely in the sandstone, but at various places it's broken through the formation above it, which is the greenish Glenwood shale, and that's what he's pointing at there. Next slide. And a third log ring cave is the Stallman's Brewery cellars that underlies the Schmidt Brewery. Some people call them the Schmidt Caves, but that's kind of a misnomer because Schmidt got a whole, it had been Stallman since Stallman started that place in 1855. And it had, and for half a century ran it. And then Jacob Schmidt took it over in about 1900. And he didn't use the caves for lagering because by that time they had, cheap electricity where you could actually do above ground refrigeration. But more on that in a bit. So these caves are actually, they're properly called the Stallman cellars rather than the Schmidt cellars. But here you can see it on an ordinary sewer map. You can kind of see. Part of the brewery. It's actually much more extensive than this. Next slide. And here we are inside those enormous lagering cellars, and it is thought that these are the largest lagering cellars in the United States in terms of just passage length. So it is definitely the largest one in St. Paul, longest one. So here's a friend of mine standing under the Schmidt Brew House, that gigantic, castle-looking, red brick castle-looking thing on West 7th Street. A very heavy object, doubtless, and that's why they had to build these piers to hold up the ceiling of the cave. And the cave would have collapsed under that tremendous weight without building these piers. Next slide. And then here we are in another passage inside the Stallman cellars, and this photograph was taken 100 years after the brewery shut down, or not the brewery after they stopped using the cellars, and it shows you just how cave-like it starts to look like a natural cave. It's an artificial space. So we have the St. Peter sandstone here, and then we have the flat Platteville limestone ceiling it's starting to grow these lengthy stalactites there. And then off in the distance, you can see a well pipe right here. You ever get spring water on West 7th and wonder where that comes from? They pump it from the ground. It comes right up through this well pipe, and it gets pumped to the surface there. So why did they abandon these caves? I mean, didn't I just say in the 1840s they thought this was such a great idea? Natural refrigeration, what a wonderful thing. Doesn't cost anything except to actually dig the cave out. So why would they give that up? And there are several reasons. I mentioned one of them, the electrification. Electricity was cheap enough where you could have a refrigeration machine, and most notably the Lindy refrigeration machine, a great invention about 1900. So you could chill things in above ground buildings without the necessity of taking them underground. But another reason is less obvious here, until I actually point it out, and that is that. Almost everyone here, I'm sure, has been to a tour of a microbrewery or a mega brewery. And you notice that, people are in like lab coats. Everything is scrupulously clean and sterile. Now look at this gunk. It's horrible. There's all kinds of dirt and filth all over in there. You don't want that stuff in contact with your beer. After the work of Pasteur, and he figured out, hey, this whole thing is based on yeast, and you want to maintain like that one particular kind of yeast. When you got all this dirt and filth, you have what are known as secondary fermentations going on. You have all kinds of other what are known as wild yeasts that you really don't want in there doing other things to your beer. And you just want that one good strain that you picked out. You don't want all these other critters in there. And so, for some of these, so it basically, bringing it up out of the caves, they could have a really clean, sterile, laboratory-like environment that we now associate with modern brewing. Next slide. Now, the Schmidt Breweries is being repurposed. Of course, the Schmidt Artist Lofts are doing a great job. You know, turning it into living space. But this gigantic labyrinth, this largest lagering labyrinth in St. Paul and perhaps anywhere, what's going to happen with that? Can we do anything with that? I've been asked that before. I got a really good idea when I was going through Germany several years ago. I went in the city of Bayreuth. There is a brewery that looks kind of like the Schmidt Brewery. You know, doesn't that kind of look Schmidtish? You know, that kind of that castle-like kind of thing. It probably dates to the same era. And this place has an extensive lagering caves under it, just like the Schmidt Brewery. Next slide. And this is what they've done with theirs. They've cleaned it out and turned it into a period museum. Not only brewing, but just like that whole time period. And they lead tours through there. And it's just a really neat place. And so if you want, like, what can you do? I'm just amazed at where you can put an artist loft. I mean, you can make almost anything into an artist loft. I mean, those caves down there, forget it. But I think you could do something like this with them under proper circumstances. Next slide. Mushroom Valley. Did you want to take a break now, or are you?
Good time to take a break, my friend, please.
What?
Take a 10-minute break right now.